On December 19, 1944, Eisenhower convened a desperate meeting in a damp barracks at Verdun. The Germans were advancing. The American lines had been breached. I turned to George Patton and asked how long it would take to pivot his entire army 90 degrees and strike north. The question hung in the cold air. Everyone in the room understood what it implied. The German offensive had created a massive bulge in the Allied lines. The 101st Airborne Division was encircled at Bastogne. American forces were retreating across a 60-mile front. Patton's Third Army was 100 miles to the south, engaged in an entirely different battle in the Saar region. To reach Bastogne, Patton would have to disengage from combat, rotate his entire army 90 degrees, march through winter storms, and assault the strongest German offensive since D-Day. The other generals at Verdun studied the map. They did the calculations in their heads. 2 weeks minimum, they concluded. Maybe 3 if the weather remains severe. Patton did not hesitate. He said he could attack on the morning of December 22. 3 days. The room went silent. General Omar Bradley suspected Patton of grandstanding. British officers exchanged skeptical glances. Even Eisenhower seemed taken aback by the audacity. But Patton was not bluffing. He had already prepared 3 complete assault plans. His staff had worked through every contingency. He knew precisely which divisions would move, which roads they would take, and where they would strike the German flank. What none of the Allied commanders realized was that 50 miles away, German intelligence officers were holding their own meeting, making calculations that would ultimately cost Germany the entire offensive. They were convinced Patton could not arrive for at least 2 weeks. Their entire strategy relied on that assumption. They were catastrophically mistaken. Major General Otto von Manschufel commanded the German 5th Panzer Army. His forces were advancing toward Bastogne from the north and east. He was confident the town would fall within days. Von Manschufel's intelligence staff had provided a detailed assessment of Allied capabilities. The report was unequivocal. American reinforcements could not arrive in time to save Bastogne. The nearest significant American force was Patton's Third Army, but Third Army was fully engaged in the Saar, 100 miles to the south. German intelligence projected it would take at least 2 weeks for Patton to disengage, regroup, and launch an offensive north. Von Manschufel studied the figures carefully. His staff had considered every factor: the distance Patton would have to cover, winter road conditions, fuel requirements, ammunition resupply, and the coordination necessary to pivot an entire army. Hitler's orders demanded they reach Antwerp. Von Manschufel privately doubted that ambitious objective, but he was confident in one assumption: Patton would not arrive in time. He told his staff the town would be secured before any American reinforcements could intervene. This conclusion was based on what they believed to be solid intelligence analysis. The German assessment was rooted in their own doctrine. Mechanized units required meticulous preparation for major operations. Moving an army was not something accomplished in 48 hours. It was a deliberate procedure that took weeks. German staff protocols demanded careful planning. Units had to be withdrawn from the line in proper sequence. Supply depots had to be repositioned. Artillery needed to move alongside infantry. Coordination required time. The Germans assumed American forces operated in the same deliberate manner. They expected Patton to require time to plan, coordinate, and accumulate logistics. They had witnessed American caution before and anticipated more of the same. But Patton was not cautious, and he had already completed his planning before anyone even asked. What the Germans did not realize was that Patton had been preparing for exactly this scenario since mid-December. He had observed the German buildup in the Ardennes. He had studied intelligence reports that everyone else had dismissed. On December 12, 4 days before the German attack began, Patton had called his staff together. He told them the Germans were going to attack through the Ardennes. When they did, Eisenhower would need Third Army to bail him out. His intelligence officer, Colonel Oskar Koch, agreed. Koch had been tracking German movements. 4 weeks. He had identified the concentration of forces. He had warned of an impending offensive. Patton told his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay, to prepare contingency plans. He wanted 3 different plans for turning the army north: 1 for attacking at Arland, 1 for Luxembourg, 1 for Dieppe. Gay thought Patton was being paranoid. Third Army was in the middle of an offensive toward the Siegfried Line. Preparing for a completely different operation seemed like a waste of time, but he knew better than to argue with Patton. For a week, while Third Army fought in the Saar, Patton's staff worked on the contingency plans. They mapped out road networks. They calculated fuel Requirements: they identified which divisions could move fastest and which would need more time. By December 18, when the German offensive was 2 days old and the crisis was becoming clear, Patton's plans were complete. He had 3 fully developed operations ready to execute. All he needed was the order. At the Verdun meeting on December 19, when Eisenhower asked how quickly he could attack, Patton already knew the answer. He had war-gamed it. He had the logistics worked out. He had briefed his division commanders the morning of December 22. Patton said 3 days and he meant it. The German intelligence officers who were calculating that Patton needed 2 weeks had no idea they were dealing with a commander who had already done the work. They had no idea that American logistics could move that fast. They were about to learn. By December 20, the situation at Bastion was desperate. The 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored Division were completely surrounded. German forces had cut every road into the town. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe commanded the surrounded American forces. He had about 18,000 men, but they were running low on ammunition, medical supplies, and food. The weather was too bad for air resupply. Inside the perimeter, it was getting quieter, not because the shooting stopped, but because they were running out of bullets. Every shot had to count. They were listening to the sounds of German tracks getting closer, wondering if anyone on the outside even knew they were still alive. On December 22, German commanders sent McAuliffe a surrender demand. The message was formal and emphasized the hopelessness of the American position. The Germans gave McAuliffe 2 hours to decide. McAuliffe's response became legendary. "Nuts," he wrote back. When the German officers asked for clarification, an American colonel explained it meant go to hell. But McAuliffe's defiance didn't change the tactical reality. His men were surrounded. German artillery was pounding the town constantly. Casualties were mounting. Without relief, Bastion would eventually fall. Von Montel and his staff knew this. They were confident they could reduce Bastion before American reinforcements arrived. Their intelligence still showed Patton at least 10 days away. What Von Montel didn't know was that at that exact moment Patton's Third Army was already moving. 3 divisions, approximately 133,000 men, were disengaging from combat in the Saar and turning north. The 4th Armored Division was leading the advance. The 26th Infantry Division and supporting infantry were following. Behind them, the entire Third Army logistics system was pivoting to support the new operation. German reconnaissance aircraft spotted some American movement on December 20th and 21st, but the weather was terrible. Visibility was poor. The Germans couldn't get a clear picture of what was happening. Their ground intelligence reported American activity in the Arland area about 25 miles south of Bastion, but the reports were fragmentary. German intelligence officers concluded it was probably local repositioning, not a major offensive. They still believed Patton was in the Saar. They still believed relief was at least a week away. They were making decisions based on assumptions that were already obsolete. What Patton was attempting was unprecedented in American military operations and rare in modern warfare. He was moving an entire army, 3 divisions, plus supporting artillery, engineers, and logistics, 90 degrees across a 75 m front in the middle of winter during Active combat. The logistics was staggering. Third Army had to move 133,000 men, 11,000 vehicles, and hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies. They had to do it on icy roads, in sub-freezing temperatures with limited daylight hours. The road network was the first problem. There were only a few good roads running north from the Tsar to the Ardennes. Every road would be packed with vehicles moving bumper to bumper for days. Patton's staff had calculated that if they used every available road, they could move one division every 24 hours. The 4th Armored would go first. The infantry divisions would follow in sequence. Traffic control was critical. Military police were positioned at every intersection. Officers with maps directed vehicles to their assigned routes. Any breakdown or accident would create a massive traffic jam. The weather made everything harder. Temperatures were below freezing. Roads were covered with ice and snow. Vehicles skidded and slid. Drivers fought to keep their trucks from sliding into ditches, but Patton's officers had trained for this. Third Army had a reputation for aggressive logistics. His quarter masters knew how to move supplies faster than any other army. His division commanders knew how to push their men hard without breaking them. The move also exposed a massive risk. Turning north meant Patton's southern flank was completely open to German counterattack. His staff warned him about the danger. Patton dismissed their concerns. He told Eisenhower the Germans should be worrying about their own flanks, not him worrying about his. On December 20th, the movement began. At 4 a.m., the first elements of the 4th Armored Division started rolling north. Behind them, an endless stream of vehicles followed. The column stretched 4 miles. Drivers were falling asleep at the wheel from exhaustion. Officers walked up and down the lines, physically waking men up to keep them moving. They knew if they stopped, the men in Baston died, so they kept driving. German reconnaissance pilots spotted parts of the movement on December 21st, but they still didn't grasp the scale. They reported increased American activity south of Luxembourg. They didn't report a full army on the march. Von Montefiol's intelligence staff received the reports and dismissed them as insignificant. One officer wrote in the daily intelligence summary that these were local adjustments with no major threat to their southern flank. They had no idea that the largest American operational movement of the war was happening right in front of them. They had no idea that their calculation was about to be shattered in less than 3 days. The German failure to detect Patton's movement wasn't just bad luck. It was the result of systemic intelligence failures that would cost them the entire offensive. The Luftwaffe had virtually no air reconnaissance capability by December 1944. Allied air superiority meant German planes couldn't fly during daylight. The few night reconnaissance missions provided limited information. German ground intelligence was almost as bad. The rapid advance had outrun their intelligence networks. They were operating in newly captured territory, where they had no agents, no local informants, and no signal intercepts. Patton had made their job even harder. He enforced total radio silence during the entire movement. Third Army, normally generating constant radio traffic for coordination, suddenly went dark. German signal intelligence units frantically searched for the missing army. The sudden blackout of an entire American army terrified German intelligence officers who realized they had lost track of over 130,000 men. Von Mantefel's staff had calculated Patton's arrival time based on rational assumptions about American operational tempo. Those assumptions were wrong because Patton was willing to accept risks that rational commanders avoided. He moved his divisions while they were still in contact with the enemy. He shifted his logistics system. On the fly, he accepted the possibility of units getting lost or running out of fuel. He gambled that speed mattered more than perfect preparation. The Germans couldn't imagine an American general taking those risks, so when their reconnaissance reported American movements south of Luxembourg on December 21st, they interpreted it as something minor, something that fit their assumptions. By the time they realized what was actually happening, it would be too late to stop it. At 6 a.m. on December 22, 3 days after the Verdun meeting, Patton's 3rd Army attacked. The 4th Armored Division hit the German southern flank. Near Arlen, Luxembourg, the German units in the area were stunned. They had received no warning that a major American force was even in the region. One moment they were consolidating positions, the next they were under heavy attack from an entire armored division. The 5th Parachute Division was holding the German line south of Baston. They were a solid unit, but they weren't prepared for what hit them. Sherman tanks came out of the snow and fog. American artillery opened up with devastating effect. Within hours, the German defensive line was penetrated. The 4th Armored punched through and began advancing toward Baston, 25 miles to the north. Patton had told them to move fast, accept casualties, and reach the surrounded garrison. At F. Montiel's headquarters, the reports started arriving around noon. Strong American armored attack near Arland. Then multiple American divisions identified. Then enemy advance toward Baston. Von Mantel looked at the map in disbelief. He asked his intelligence chief how this was possible. Patton was supposed to be in the Tsar. The intelligence officer had no answer. The entire assessment had been wrong. Patton wasn't 10 days away. He was here now and he was attacking with overwhelming force. Von Mantel immediately ordered reinforcements to block the American advance, but he didn't have many reserves available. Most of his forces were committed to taking Baston from the north or pushing west toward the Meuse River. He pulled the Panzer Layer Division and elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division to create a blocking force south of Baston. These were elite units, but they had to move into position while under attack. It was a desperate improvisation. The battle south of Baston became a brutal slugging match. German forces fought hard to keep the Americans from reaching the surrounded garrison. The 4th Armored Division fought through village after village, taking casualties, but maintaining momentum. But the Germans couldn't stop what was coming. Behind the 4th Armored, the entire 3rd Army was arriving. The 26th Infantry Division and supporting infantry were moving into position. Patton had brought overwhelming force. The German southern flank was collapsing. On December 23, von Mantel sent an urgent message to Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B. The message was blunt. Patton had attacked their southern flank with at least 3 divisions. Their intelligence estimates had been catastrophically wrong. Model was furious. His entire offensive relied on having sufficient time to capture Bastogne and push to the Meuse before American reinforcements arrived. If Patton was already attacking in strength, their timetable was destroyed. Model called von Manchevel and demanded an explanation. How had an entire American army moved 100 miles without detection? How had their intelligence missed this? Von Manchevel was told that Patton's forces had moved faster than anyone had believed possible. Their calculations had assumed a standard American operational tempo. Patton was not operating conventionally. What von Manchevel didn't say aloud but fully understood was that this likely meant the German offensive was doomed. If Patton could relieve Bastogne, the entire German salient would be exposed to a counterattack from the south. Model ordered von Manchevel to hold Bastogne at all costs. They needed that town. Model warned that if Bastogne held and Patton linked up with the garrison, they would lose their best roads west. The offensive would stall. But issuing the order and executing it were two different matters. Von Manchevel now faced combat on two fronts. His forces in and around Bastogne were fighting the 101st Airborne inside the town while simultaneously attempting to block Patton's approach from the south. German units were being stretched thin. Attacking units were pulled back to defensive positions. Reserves intended to continue the westward drive were diverted to stop Patton. The entire operational plan was unraveling. The German offensive had depended on speed and momentum, seize Bastogne quickly, reach the Meuse, and split the Allied forces before they could respond. But Patton had reacted faster than anyone expected. The Germans remained dangerous. They had well-trained units and capable commanders, but they had lost the initiative. They were reacting to Patton instead of executing their plan, and in mobile warfare, that was usually fatal. At 4:50 p.m. on December 26, 1944, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division entered Bastogne. The siege was broken. The surrounded garrison was relieved. Patton had accomplished what the Germans had deemed impossible. First Lieutenant Charles Bogus, commanding the lead Sherman tank, Cobra King, made contact with the 101st Airborne. His battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, followed closely behind. The 37th Tank Battalion had fought through 4 days of brutal combat, covering 25 miles from Arlon to Bastogne against determined German resistance. Yet they had arrived. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne had held despite being outnumbered and surrounded. When the first Sherman tanks appeared, soldiers emerged from their positions cheering, some in tears. They had endured a week of hell and survived. When Cobra King's hatch opened, there was no formal salute, just exhausted men shaking hands in the snow. The 101st had held the line, but seeing that white star on a Sherman tank was the first time in a week they truly believed they were going home. General McAuliffe met with the relief column commanders shortly after their arrival. The surrounded garrison could finally be resupplied and reinforced. The relief of Bastogne was militarily significant, but it was also symbolically devastating to the Germans. They had risked everything on a rapid breakthrough before American reserves could intervene. Patton had shattered that timeline. Von Manchevel received word of the breakthrough at his headquarters and immediately grasped the implications. He told his staff the offensive was over. Bastogne could not be taken, and pushing to the Meuse was impossible. They would be fortunate to hold their existing positions. His chief of staff argued they still had strong forces and could continue westward attacks. Von Manchevel shook his head. With Patton assaulting their southern flank and Bastogne still in American hands, they were now an salient, not a breakthrough. Continuing west would only risk encirclement. Model at Army Group headquarters still wanted to continue the offensive, but he was receiving similar assessments from other commanders. Momentum was gone. Surprise was lost. Allied reinforcements were arriving from every direction. On December 27, Hitler ordered the offensive to continue. Field commanders recognized it was hopeless, but they had no choice, they would fight until they could not. Yet everyone understood the truth, Patton had stopped the German offensive. He had done it in 3 days when the Germans had calculated he needed 2 weeks. The impossible had become reality, and the German army was about to pay the price. Patton believed the relief of Bastogne vindicated his entire approach to warfare. He had championed speed and aggression throughout his career. The operation proved that method worked. Patton told his staff after the battle that the key to mobile warfare was not overwhelming force, but moving faster than the enemy could react. If you could disrupt the enemy's decision cycle, you won regardless of relative strength. This was the principle German intelligence had failed to consider. They had calculated force ratios, movement speeds, logistics, and terrain, but not decision-making speed. Patton made decisions faster than German commanders, accepted risks they would not, and moved before they believed it possible. This tempo advantage outweighed numerical superiority. In a January 1945 press conference, a reporter asked Patton how he had moved so quickly. Patton replied that they had not moved quickly, they had moved normally. Everyone else had moved too slowly. That statement captured the fundamental difference in military culture. What appeared impossible to the Germans was standard procedure for Patton. What seemed risky to cautious commanders was acceptable risk to him. The relief of Bastogne became one of Patton's signature achievements. It was widely covered in newspapers and reinforced his reputation as America's most aggressive and effective combat commander. Yet Patton was already focused on the next operation. He wrote in his diary on December 29 that Bastogne was a necessary diversion. Now they needed to return to the offensive and drive into Germany. The war would not be won by defensive victories alone. That aggressive mindset, the constant drive to the next attack, advance, or objective, was what set Patton apart. And it was exactly what the Germans had failed to anticipate when calculating his arrival time. Military historians consistently identify the relief of Bastogne as one of World War II's greatest logistical feats. It is studied in staff colleges today, not just as history, but as the ultimate example of rapid redeployment. What made the operation legendary was that it succeeded precisely because Patton defied conventional military wisdom. He moved forces while in contact with the enemy, prioritized speed over preparation, and accepted risks doctrine warned against. The Germans were correct that the operation was extremely risky, but wrong that it was impossible. The distinction matters. Impossible means it cannot be done, extremely risky means it may succeed if the leader, troops, and planning are right. Patton had confidence in his preparation, logistics, and soldiers, and the gamble paid off. Bastogne was relieved, the German offensive collapsed, and the German intelligence officers who had calculated 2 weeks learned the hard way that sometimes the impossible takes only 3 days if you have an army, a mission, and the will to see it through.